Hi everyone, thanks for joining us, or rather joining me today for this webinar on how to do well, or rather how to ace your economics internal assessment. So I'm going to start very promptly, or rather in a short while. And for some of you who have met me before, either in prior seminars or through my emails, would know that my name is Shoei. I'm actually one of the co-founders of LXP. And previously we've had our math IA and conducted our TOK webinar, and then this is the third in the series, which is going to be for economics. Now, I have prepared just a very short, or rather an hour-long presentation, I hope. And what I really want to look forward to is towards the end, when there's Q&A, if any of you have any sample of the articles you've chosen, or even anything for me to have a quick look, I'll be more than happy to even show your article to everyone and probably give you guys my comments whether it's a good choice of article or not. Okay, so as promised, so we'll be focusing on econs today, and I'm going to start off by talking about the choice of articles. Okay, the reason why we're going to start off with this is because the article that you choose will determine how well your essay is going to be written. Okay, and I have seen students struggling to find a very good articles. Okay, and sometimes they always end up making the mistake of thinking that the longer the article, the better it is. So I'm going to share a few tips with how do you find a good article, right? Number one, it has to originate from a reliable source. Now, having said that, you need to know that there are two types of article. Okay, even from reliable sources like Bloomberg, CNBC, CNN. Okay, there are going to be sources which are going to be more factual in nature. Right? Factual in nature means that they're going to just provide the data and information as it is. Okay? And then you're going to have an opinion piece. Okay? For example, so Bloomberg has a Bloomberg opinion where they will invite guest writers down and they will share their opinion regarding maybe the most recent interest rate hike or the most recent fiscal policy implemented by the US government. Okay, now the thing about factual and opinion article is this, right? When it is factual, okay, you are more certain that the information inside are more objective because they're going to tell you and provide information as it is, right? But when it is opinion, it's going to be a lot more of what the author thinks and what the author feels. Okay, so generally, I would strongly encourage you to pick articles that are more factual in nature. Okay, it's not that you can't pick opinionated articles, just that sometimes opinionated articles can be a tad too long, 3-4 pages, and out of the 3-4 pages, maybe like half of the content is based on what the author thinks and feels, and then you can't find like the more objective data and statistics that you actually want from it. And number two, okay, you want to make sure that your article contains objective statements. What do I mean by that? Meaning that it is quite linked to the first point. It has to be factual. Okay, when they say something, when they talk about obesity, all right, or even they want to talk about the obesity situation in America, you need to make sure that it's backed by data. Okay, versus so the very first example I have, consumption of sugary drinks resulted in an increase in obesity rate from 10 to 20%, rather than a statement that just states that, in America, children are getting fatter because they like to drink soft drinks. While this statement may not necessarily be wrong, they are subjective in nature. And it makes it difficult for you to actually use it in your article or in your written content, right? Because you can't quote anything from that. Okay, and then it is more subjective. So what I like to do whenever when I try to advise my students in terms of article, I love to see numbers. Okay, the more numbers you have in an article, the safer you are. Okay, but having said that, you have to make sure that the numbers are reliable. Okay, reliable meaning, for example, it is from like if you talk about obesity rate, okay, it has to come from maybe the National Health Board in US, for example. If you talk about inflation in US, it has to come from the government. Okay, so the second example would be if you want to deal with articles about inflation, make sure they give you the data, right? If it's going to be what is the inflation rate? How much did it increase by? Okay, so avoid articles that talks about the prices in the US are so high, families are struggling to purchase daily essentials or necessities. Okay, and the last article and the last example I have for you would be, as you can see, there's always a number, a data, a statistics there for you that you can use. Okay, so what you've realized so far is that in terms of the three examples I've given you, they happen to fall into each category, or rather each segment of your econ syllabus, right? The first one being your microeconomics, the second being your macroeconomics, and the third one being your trade. I'm sensing that most of you are probably DP1, which means that you're either having done your micro already, submitted a micro, and doing your macro, or doing your micro and will be doing your macro soon. Okay, so I'm guessing that trade probably wouldn't happen anytime soon for you. Okay, moving on. Third, right? You want to make sure that it contains statistics to support your economic concepts. Okay, so what are some statistics that you want to be looking at? Okay, again, I have a couple of examples here. Number one, if you want to talk about, let's talk about micro, right? And the first two examples I've given you are actually under market failure. Okay, what kind of numbers are you looking at? You want to look at, you want to see the article providing you the tax rates. Okay, they want some sort of data to show how the consumption of cigarette has changed. Okay, and or effects of reduced consumption. When I talk about effects of reduced consumption, it means the impact on society, right? Are we seeing a decrease in the overall the mortality rate, for example? Are we seeing a decrease in people having respiratory symptoms, for example? So that's what I mean by effects of reduced consumption. Okay, so that's kind of statistics. So for example, right, we talk about, the government has increased tax on cigarette by 10%. This has resulted in the consumption of cigarette to reduce by 20%. And we see that there's a decrease in the number of hospital admission due to respiratory symptoms. For example, this is just very generic, right? So when you talk about subsidies, again, this is part of the micro market failure concept. And then, similar to cigarettes, subsidies is the opposite, because consumption of healthcare would then fall under your positive externality and a merit good. Okay, similarly, you want to be able to find numbers to support what is the effects of increased consumption of healthcare. For example, are we seeing an increase in the mortality? For example, are we seeing people living over a longer period? Are we seeing an earlier diagnosis of cancer or terminal illnesses, for example, right? So those are good, nice numbers that you should have. And then I'm going to move on to the third and the fourth point, which is on macroeconomics. So in macro, generally, you're either talking about interest rates, which is a monetary policy, or fiscal policy, which is the government spending. Okay, so interest rates are, so when it comes to macro, I'm not too concerned about statistics. Why? Because macro is about the country and economy. So it is very easy to find statistics because it is published. It has to be released on either a quarterly or a monthly basis. So it's out open to public. So when it comes to macro, you don't really have an issue trying to find articles with statistics, because if you do a simple Google search for the choice of macro article you want, most articles will be able to give you all these statistics. Interest rate changes, how the unemployment change, what's the GDP growth, is it a month-on-month growth, is it a year-on-year change, is it a quarter-on-quarter change, right? Similarly, government spending, how much did the government spend, how much more? Okay, I mean, obviously, sometimes if you have additional information like, is it a deficit spending, right? It's a deficit spending would mean that you are spending beyond your means, where your revenue cannot cover your government spending, right? How did unemployment rate change? How did GDP growth change? And lastly, this is very specific to international econs. It would be tariff, and how the implementation of tariff led to changes in trade and how it has effects on businesses. Okay, so when it comes to international tariff, things are a little bit tricky, because it is not easy to find data talking about effects on businesses. Okay, when you go into international econs, you would understand what I mean, right? It is easy to find what would the change in the tariff rates be? Okay, but then subsequently, in terms of finding data to talk about how the changes would impact the domestic economy, sometimes the numbers are harder to find. Okay, and lastly, your article should have an ideal length of 1 to 2 pages long. Okay, and in my opinion, the shorter it is, the easier it is. Okay, as long as it fulfills all the criteria above. Okay, what are the criteria? As long as number one, it comes from a reliable source, it is factual in nature, my preference. Again, I said my preference is for it to be factual in nature. Number three, it is you have more objective statements, which is just giving you the numbers and telling you what the situation is in the economy or on businesses. Okay, why you want to avoid long articles is because I've seen students being overwhelmed by the very lengthy content that they have in the article. When it's 3-4 pages and there's so much, so many words, so much content, a lot of quotation, someone is saying something, this business owner is saying something, the US Federal Reserve Governor is saying another thing, and then they'll end up not knowing how to approach the IA, and I call it analysis paralysis. Okay, so again, right, the shorter it is not, okay, don't fall in the mindset of thinking that the more content you have, the better it is. Okay, no. In fact, I have seen students doing really well with a single page article because it provided sufficient information for the student to write a very good IA. So now I'm going to move on to how you should be structuring your internal assessment. And this is the guidelines that I've given all my students over the many years. Regardless whether it's micro, macro, international, it applies the same. And for today's example, not only will I explain to you what the 4 key paragraphs are, I'm going to show you side by side how a sample of a micro IA followed this structure and how a macro IA followed this structure. Okay, so you can actually visualize and understand what do I mean when I say certain things. So, firstly, the first paragraph would be your introduction. Okay, and it's going to be short. The second paragraph is just explaining the problem with the diagram. The third paragraph, you explain how the solution solves the problem with a diagram. And you would have noticed something at this side, right? The first 3 paragraphs, I've given you an estimate on a number of word counts, and it ranges between 100 and 150. And you know that your IA is 750 words. So what does it mean? Yes, you're right. Your last paragraph is your evaluation paragraph. Evaluation plus conclusion. I always encourage students 400 words. Okay? So later on, I will share with you why is it easy to craft the first 3 paragraphs and what you can do and what are some framework you can apply to ensure that your evaluation paragraph has all the meaty analysis and content that will allow you to score very high. Okay, so let's move on to the first part, which is the introduction. Again, keep it simple, 100 to 150 words. Sorry, let me come back. Yeah, 100 to 150 words. In this example of this micro IA, this is a micro example. So in this case, you can see that the student here has defined 4 concepts, right? Number 1, demerit good. Number 2, market failure. Number 3, allocative efficiency. And number 4, negative externality. Now, if you are going to do market failure, which is always my recommendation, okay, these are the 4 definitions that you always have to include. And the reason is because when you talk about demerit good, you cannot not talk about market failure. And when you talk about market failure, you cannot not talk about allocative efficiency. Okay, and when you talk about allocative, or rather when you talk about demerit goods, again, you cannot not talk about negative externality. So in this particular example, these 4 definitions are must-have when you do micro. Okay, so I always tell my students when you do micro, always choose market failure because number 1, it's easy to find information. Number 2, the approach and the structure is quite standard. Okay, and you can also score very well, even though it is very commonly tested. I see students trying to choose price ceiling and price floors articles, it's not that it's not that you can't do out of it, but it's a bit riskier because it's hard to find good articles for such concepts, right? Again, it's hard to find good articles, but when it comes to market failure, it's easy. And then of course, for some of the HR students, you're asking, what about theory of the firm? Okay, so a theory of the firm, because the only problem that you can talk about will be monopoly power. Sometimes it's also hard to find good articles. Next, I want to show you how a macro introduction will look like. Okay, so this article, it's about Singapore's plan to increase taxes and government spending. So for this student, he defined number one, contractionary fiscal policy, and number two, interventionist supply side policy. Okay, so for those of you who have not done macro or have done macro and wondering what is interventionist supply side policy, it is another form of government policy along with fiscal and monetary policy. Okay, so introduction, keep it short, keep it simple, just do your definition. Next, let's move on to the second key paragraph, which is explain the problem with a diagram. Now, I want to emphasize the importance of understanding what is an economic problem, because I've seen students choosing articles, and when I ask them, what is the problem in this article, and quite a number of them will not be able to identify the problem. Okay, because they think that's economic related, they see that there's a policy, and they think there's a good choice. Okay, in every article that you choose, there must be a problem. Okay, so for example, if you talk about theory of the firm, earlier on I talked about monopoly power. Okay, monopoly power is a problem. And with every problem, there will always be like a negative outcome. So for example, in this case, it will be higher prices, lower output, and dead weight loss. So moving on to market failure. Again, negative externalities, that's a problem, right? And negative externalities will come from your demerit goods like cigarettes and alcohol. Okay, what is the negative impact or outcome from it? You overconsume your demerit goods, leading to dead weight loss. Similarly, positive externalities on merit goods. What is the outcome? The problem is the positive externalities on healthcare education. The outcome would be the underconsumption of such goods, also leading to dead weight loss. So if you're not familiar with dead weight loss, it also sometimes means welfare loss or loss to society. So when we talk about macroeconomics, the problem usually would be a slowdown in economic activity, and the outcome would be unemployment and decrease in GDP, or rather recession. Okay, now when it comes to tariff, things are a little bit trickier. I'm going to explain to you why. Because we understand tariff as a policy, as a solution, okay? And in micro and macro, all your policies and solutions actually lead to a positive outcome, okay? However, if you think about tariff has the opposite effect, because tariffs goes against the principles of economic efficiency, right? It is protectionism. So when we talk about economic problem, the economic problem here is actually the implementation of tariff, right? It's a bit different, right? Because the problem here actually is a government policy. The problem is the implementation of tariff. Why? Because of tariff and trade protectionism, they're going to lead to a higher price, lower output, and if you remember your graph, there will be dead weight loss. Okay, so number one, when you talk about paragraph 2, explain the problem, always know very clearly what is the problem that this article is focusing on. And then you're going to use the before, change, after framework to illustrate this problem. Okay, so this framework, when you use it, it just disciplines you to make sure that you know how to frame your words, you know how to structure your sentences to make sure that everything is covered and in sequence. So this is the same example, from the same micro IA, but this is the second paragraph. So earlier on, I talked about the before, change, after framework. Okay, I'm going to give you guys some time to just quickly read through this article, or rather this paragraph. Okay, and if you look at this paragraph, you will realize that it actually explains the problem. Now, what is the problem? The problem is actually the externality. Okay, so what I've highlighted in yellow is basically the before. Before the problem happened, before the problem happened? Okay, what is the situation in this? Okay, so I have another student who asked a question. So I have someone asking a question, right? So I'm gonna just pause what I'm doing right now and to answer this question live. So someone asked, my teacher said to beware of sources like The Economist that already do a lot of analysis. So could you please elaborate on this? So what do you realize? I don't know whether Pete, you just join us or were you in from the start? Because if you were to go back to my earlier slide, you would realize that when I talk about reliable sources, right? You will realize that I actually did not include economists. Why? Not because it's not reliable, but economists is a heavily opinionated source. It's a very heavily opinionated source. So they don't just give information as it is, right? And in the factual sources that are given you, you'll realize that you can actually find an article that is 1 page long. But in 1 page long article would have given you the information, right? How the interest rate change, why the interest rate change, what is the expected impact of interest rate change. Now, when we talk about economists, it is very opinionated. It's about what the author thinks, what the author feels, and what the author prognosticate may happen in the future. And that's why you see I didn't include economists. Okay, so if you have some examples, any one of you, if there's some examples of some articles that you have in mind but you're not sure whether it's good, maybe towards the end you can just send me the link in the chat and I'll just have a quick look and let you know. Okay, so moving on to this. Yeah, so I have another one, someone else asking whether I'm able to share the slides or the recording. So I'll be able to share the recording, and all I need you to do is just drop me an email. So you should have received an email from me. Drop me an email and I will send a recording to you so you can review this. Okay, so coming back to this point, over here in this paragraph, you notice, right, the yellow highlight refers to what happened before. What happened before the problem, okay? And the problem is the externality, and the change is basically how did the sugar drink change the market equilibrium? Okay, and so over here they explain that because of the externality, your MPB is higher because consumers fail to consider the increased likelihood of disease due to externality. And therefore, the red part here would be what happened after, right? So it's very systematic. What happened after is that there's an overproduction as QM as compared to the socially optimal cure, leading to welfare loss. Okay, and I'm going to show you how the same before change after framework is also applied to this macro example. And this macro article is the same article that we saw earlier on when I showed the introduction. And just to refresh your memory, that this article talks about the increases in government spending as well as taxes as the Singapore government tries to promote the economy while battling inflation. Okay, so over here, I just want to quickly show you. Again, the yellow highlight shows what happened before, right? So what happened before, which is just simply saying that AD intersects AS at YP and at PL. So that's telling you that and you realize that we always mention output and price, and then the change. An increase in government spending will result in excess demand, shown the rightward shift. So always make sure that when you explain, it is always making reference to the diagram. Okay, so whatever they have in this diagram, which is your ADAS, your price level, and your Y, which is your real output level, always make sure that they are being referenced in your paragraph. Okay, and then obviously the after, which is the impact of what an increase in AD did. For the purpose of this article, it was very much focused on inflation, and therefore the student talk about how inflation increased from PL to PL1. Okay, you could also talk about how real output increased from YP to Y1. However, sometimes you have to contextualize, right? If the article is mostly focused on inflation, then maybe there's no need to talk about output because you don't want to complicate things. Now, I'm not sure whether you guys have noticed this, that somehow this paragraph is a lot longer than what you see in the micro. And you will realize that there is this huge chunk of many sentences that is mentioned right after the red words, right? So they say, government spending on infrastructure such as rails and ports increases efficiency, blah, 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 blah. Further government spending on education improves the quality of labor resources. As a result, there's a growth in potential output. And then we talk about the shift in AS. Now, if we were to go back, okay, let's go back to the introduction of this particular macro. Okay, in this introduction, the policies is actually increased taxes and government spending. Okay, however, because the government spending is specific on infrastructure and education, right? We need to be able to identify that this is also a form of intervention in supply side policy. And therefore, this student had to mention also the supply side effect of the increase in government spending on education and infrastructure. Okay, so what I'm going to share now is this. I'm not sure how many of you have done macro before, or rather have done macro or are doing macro. When you do macro, the easiest choice of policy is always monetary policy. Okay, it's the easiest. It is most straightforward because it has a direct impact on everyday money. It's straightforward. Okay, the moment you want to choose an article that talks about fiscal policy, okay, you have to be very careful what kind of fiscal policy, because if the government spending happens to be on infrastructure and education, for example, there will always be a supply side effect like what is happening here. And therefore, you have to talk about how AS will also shift. You see, and you see the quotes there, countries, rails, and ports. Because these countries, rails, and ports appeared in the article, you cannot ignore it, right? I know some students were like, okay, should I talk about supply side? I don't want to talk about supply side because, this is clearly a government spending. But when we talk about countries, rails, and ports, you cannot choose to ignore it, okay? So long story short, for macro, the safer option is to talk about monetary policy. If you talk about fiscal, just beware, right? Is the government spending actually on the supply? Does it have a supply side effect? Okay, next. So after you explain the problem with the diagram, the next part is to explain how the solution solves the problem. Again, with a diagram. So every problem comes with a solution, or rather a policy. Some of you may call it a policy. Okay, I won't call it a policy. Let me think. Okay, actually you can. Yeah, I think policy is fair. Okay, policy solution. So for example, the three examples I gave earlier on, right? And this example I've given you, right? If you talk about market failure and negative externalities and cigarette consumption, for example, tax is one of the default solution, right? You know it. When you talk about macroeconomics, and if there's a slowdown economic growth, it's either fiscal or monetary policy. Okay, and we talk about the problem of a tariff resulting in protectionism and debit loss, right? The policy, or rather the solution, would there be to encourage free trade. Again, I shared earlier on, international trade is a different story from your micro and macro. Okay, now I'm going to say something as well, right? Why did I put a question mark there? Why did I say whether is it proposed or implemented? Because you have to know that there are two types of articles that you would actually come across on the internet. Number one, there will be article that would talk about the effects of the implementation of the solution. And that's how you're going to get statistics about the outcomes. Okay? But there will also be articles that will talk about the proposed solution, which means the government is contemplating doing this. So there will be nothing about how, for example, what is the decrease in consumption of cigarettes, for example, or what is the increase in employment from this particular solution. So there are two types of article, okay? Proposed or implemented, okay? My take is this, right? Either or are fine. Obviously, if we talk about implemented, you have more data to support your outcome. When you write an outcome, you have more to do it. But having said that, sometimes I also like propose, because when nothing has been set in stone, or rather when you don't know what the outcome is, it gives you the opportunity to write a very powerful evaluation paragraph. And I'm going to show you that later. Right, similar to the previous paragraph, you want to use the before, change, after framework. I'm going to show you this. So this is for the micro concept, okay? Before, change, after, and you will realize that there's not much to talk about before. Why? Because in the earlier paragraph, you already talk about the impact of the problem, which is that there is a deadweight loss, which is that you're producing at QM, which is greater than QO. Okay, so now your focus is really about the solution, the policy. How does it solve the problem? How does it solve the problem? So in this case, we are going to tackle the problem of overconsumption of a demerit good, which is sugary drinks. Okay, and I told you that the default solution here will be tax. So in this article, or rather in this IA, this student talk about instating a per unit tax amount equivalent to the externality of the soft drink. Okay, it's so specific. Why must it be specific? Because that is the only way you would lead to your MPC plus tax to intersect your MPB at QO. Okay, I repeat, if you talk about market failure and you want to talk about tax and subsidy, always remember to talk about how it has to be equivalent to the externality. Why? Because if it's not equivalent to the externality, you don't solve the problem. Because in order for your QM to hit QOP, your per tax unit must be the same as externality. That's how precise we have to be. Okay, and of course, the second underline just kind of explains the mechanism of how that works, which will decrease quantity produced, leading to a leftward shift in supply, in this case, your MPC plus tax, right? And then, of course, what happens in the end? Your MPC plus tax would then intersect MPB at the socially optimal output of QOP, and you have to talk about allocated efficiency, and you have to talk about how the welfare loss is eliminated. So this is an example, and again, a company, your diagram would have to reflect how the solution solves the problem. Okay, so now that I have given you an example of how the third paragraph should be, I'm going to address, I won't call it a burning question, but I've seen students asking about, how many diagrams can I draw? And what kind of diagrams can I draw? Okay, the rule of thumb is always this. Okay, your teacher wants to see 2 diagrams, right? I think it's in the marking rubrics, you know that. And the 2 diagrams that I always recommend is number 1, first diagram is to illustrate the problem, which is what you see in paragraph 2. And the second diagram, which is to show how the solution solves the problem. I have seen students trying to overcomplicate things, and they'll draw a single diagram where they can show the solution as well as show how. They'll draw a single diagram and they'll show the problem, and then they will also show how the solution solved the problem. So it becomes that there are many moving parts in that first diagram, right? And then afterwards they realize, hey, look, I also need to draw a second diagram. And then they'll draw a completely random diagram that may not be as relevant to the article. Okay, so ignore that, okay? First diagram, problem, second diagram, solution. So this is the macro example. Similarly, if you can recall earlier on, we were talking about increasing tax as well as increasing government spending to fight inflation in Singapore. Okay, so this is how you would craft your third paragraph, and how in explaining how the problem, or rather how the solution would solve the problem. Okay, the solution here would be an increase in GST coupled with higher income and business tax rates. Okay, the mechanism would be a reduction in household disposable income, discouraging consumer spending at the same time, decreasing after-tax profits, disincentivizing investment. So that's a mechanism, okay? Make sure that you can explain the mechanism well as well, okay? You have to understand how the mechanism will lead to a graphical change, okay? Because if you see, why do we have to talk about discouraging consumer spending and disincentivizing investment? Because now then you can link them, right? You can talk about how consumer spending and investment, they are components of aggregate demand, and therefore this will lead to a level shape of AD. Okay, and eventually, not only will you rectify the inflation, which is actually your price levels will decrease, PL to PL1, and it will reduce inflation. Okay, so you will notice something that in the first two paragraphs, it is very concept. It's almost like writing. It's almost like writing on the economic concept of how the policy works and how and why and how the policy and how the problem impacts the society, right? So, for example, in the second paragraph, you would see that the content, or rather the paragraph, is quite similar to just it's quite very conceptual, but there's actually some contextualization required as well. Okay, so it's a mix of both, but yes, you're right that it can be very conceptual, very concept-based, which is fine. Why? Because I'm going to move on to the most important part here. Okay, the evaluation. Okay, I've seen students spending too much time explaining the problem, as well as too much time explaining how the solution solved the problem. Okay, and the fact is, it's not because they have a lot to write, but it's rather they don't know how to keep their pointers concise. So it becomes very repetitive. And sometimes you'll realize that actually writing econs, even if you do an econs essay, sometimes you find yourself repeating yourself, and you don't know, how can I keep it? How can I keep it concise? Is this necessary? Is it not necessary? Okay, so I'm going to leave the question towards the end. So in the meantime, whatever questions that you have, you can still feel free to type in the chat, but I'm going to keep it to the end because I have a couple coming in here. So now this is the most important part, right? Which is how to write an evaluation. And I would say that it's not easy. Okay, it's not easy because then you realize that it is not as conceptual anymore. Okay. Similarly, there are 4 key paragraphs to writing an IA. There are also 4 key points to crafting a great evaluation. Okay, the first would be advantages, followed by disadvantages. The third would be contextualize, and the fourth would be alternative solutions. Now, most students can do A, B, and D well. Why? Because you can actually extract all these pointers from your textbook or even from the school notes they've given, right? So if you learn econs from a resource, whether it's printed or even an online resource, right? Advantages, disadvantages, alternative solutions, those are what you would know. Okay. The trick here is how do you contextualize all of these while with respect to the article. And that's what I see a lot of students struggle with. So I'm going to show you an example of how the importance of contextualizing and how that would differentiate you from everyone else who would just provide very conceptual evaluation, right? They'll just list advantages, they'll list the disadvantages, they'll just talk about alternative solutions. But a lot of students struggle to make reference back to the article to make sure that it is contextualized. So back to the micro example, remember we're talking about sugary drinks and we were talking about the implementation of tax. Okay, so in this evaluation, this student actually, in the first paragraph, this student actually focused on the advantages, and there are only 2 advantages that he highlighted. Number 1, how it internalized the externality. Okay, if you're not familiar with this term called internalizing the externality, it is actually an official advantage of tax and subsidies in your IB textbook. Okay, so if you have textbook, you will find this. If you don't have a textbook, you may not come across this. Okay, and the second advantage here is that tax would raise revenue for the government. Okay, so in this situation, they are both conceptual. There's no reference made from the article, right? Nothing is contextualized. Okay, and the second paragraph here, he moved on to the disadvantages, or some of you may call the limitations of a solution. Okay, so over here, he mentioned a total of 3 disadvantages. Number 1, the size of the externality is hard to estimate. This is also conceptual, meaning that it is either in your textbook or in your notes. Number 2, demand for sugary drinks may be inelastic. Again, it may not be disadvantageous, but it could be like a limitation of this particular solution. And in this case, would be the limitation of tax. Okay. Number 3, right? He mentioned that a large tax will lead to consumer backlash and discontent among soft drink producers. So this, however, is not from the textbook. It's not conceptual. And that's why I underline it. It is contextualized. It is something that the student managed to identify from the article. Because the article mentioned this. The article mentioned that there could be consumer backlash and discontent. And therefore, he used it as part of the disadvantage. Okay, and that's why it's highlighted as a disadvantage at the same time as underlined as contextualized. Okay, so this is what I mean by it is very easy and common for students to just list the advantages and disadvantages that they can learn from textbook. Okay, the challenge here will be to contextualize it. And if you notice for this particular essay, or rather this particular IA for this micro one, he has not used any data and statistics. And the reason is because this article is a proposed solution. Okay, it's a proposed solution, not an implemented solution, which means that there are no numbers talking about the outcomes of the solution. Okay, and lastly, right, this is still the same paragraph 4, by the way, just to let you know. So I know that you actually see 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs, right? But I actually broke it up into 4 paragraphs, but this student actually submitted as one single paragraph. Okay, I mean, how you structure it doesn't matter, but I will consider these 4 paragraphs as your evaluation plus conclusion. Now, coming down to this, so he has done advantages and disadvantages. Then he proposed alternative solutions. Now, the first of which is to talk about charging it on a per unit of sugar as opposed to per unit of soft drink. All right, and you notice that it's also underlined, which means that this alternative solution was actually something that he derived from the article itself. Okay, so that's why that when you read your article, you need to be able to identify what are some of the statements in the article that allows you to list it down, to mention it as an advantage, mention it as a disadvantage, or mention it as an alternative solution. Okay, the second alternative solution is he talked about education through advertising. Okay, because this one, education through advertising, is a conceptual alternative solution to tax, right? We know that if we are talking about market failure, okay, apart from tax, there's always education and legislation. So he mentioned it. At the same time, he actually tried to contextualize it, right, by saying that, look, in the article, they talk about the demonstration they talk about the consumer backlash. And therefore, he used that as an opportunity to talk about how, even though education could be an alternative solution, but he thinks that it's not going to be as effective, given that the country has already suffered consumer backlash. So that's why I said, demonstrated by the consumer backlash, it is possible that consumption of soft drinks has been so ingrained in the culture of New Zealand that advertising may fail to affect demand significantly. Right? So again, this part here is not from textbook. He contextualized it. Okay? And lastly, warning label of soft drinks and water-only policies in schools. So these are alternative policies that came from the article, and that's why it's underlined contextual. It is also an alternative solution. Okay? At the same time, you cannot just mention it as an alternative solution. You need to come up with your own opinion and your own analysis. So in this case, he talks about how there are more forceful methods and how the mechanism work, right? It actually curbs demand by shifting your MPB closer to MSB. Moreover, the restriction on soft drinks in schools may serve to elevate the severity of sugar addiction. So he talks about how it's a good thing. Okay, so this is an example of how you need to integrate your information from the article so that you can really craft a very powerful evaluation paragraph. So I'm going to show you the macro example of this. Firstly, what you have here is the first paragraph will be the advantages. So this student talk about three advantages. Number one, that the proposed solution which will result in economic growth, will provide opportunity for high incomes and high standards of living. Of course, these are all conceptual. We know that. You can find it in your textbook. You can find it from own resources. Number two, it says that it also allows Singapore to remain competitive. Now, this is an advantage, but this is also contextualizing. The only difference is that in this situation, he did not use information from the article, right? The article didn't say allow Singapore to be competitive, okay? But he knew, or rather he knows, that Singapore has a very unique characteristics, and it is explained in the next underline. Due to its small size, Singapore is restricted by a small domestic market, thus international trade is of paramount importance to overall economic activity. And that's why remaining competitive is actually an advantage for Singapore. Okay, and the third advantage is a skilled workforce and advanced infrastructure. So in this case, the way the student contextualized it is different from what he did for his micro. Okay, in his micro article, he picked out information on the article, he put it in his evaluation paragraph. And in macro, he understood that Singapore is a very unique economy, and therefore explain why the nature of the economy makes the need to remain competitive important. Okay? And next, the second paragraph, he talks about the disadvantages of the solution. Again, he separated his solution to two types, right? Because earlier on I talked about how for this particular macro article, even though it was a fiscal policy, it was a fiscal government spending on infrastructure and education. Therefore, you cannot ignore the supply side effects, and hence, he had to talk about the disadvantages of interventionist supply side policies. And there are three in total. Number one, time lag. Okay, this is so again conceptual, as in your textbook. Number two, it can also increase inflation. Okay, and number three, because of inflation, firms may become more cautious in making decisions, and this could also affect economic growth. Okay, again, these are all conceptual. And moving on, so he has covered the interventionist supply side disadvantages. Now he's going to talk about the increase in taxes. Because if you recall earlier on, the solution in this particular example, in this particular IA, would be increase government spending and increase taxes. So he addressed the government spending, now he's going to address the taxes. Okay, again, he has three disadvantages of increasing taxes. Number one, the tax rates may not bring the desired increase in AD if households and firms are optimistic about future prospects. Now, this is a particular limitation of tax and subsidies, or rather, not tax and subsidies, but on fiscal policy and monetary policy. Okay, and this is something that I realize a lot of students are not familiar with if you're doing macro. So, even though the expected outcome from, let's say in this example, an increase in tax should be a decrease in consumption and investment. Okay, consumption by households, investment by firms, even though that's an expected outcome, right? I increase my tax rates, firms will have less profit to invest, households will have less income to consume, and therefore my C&I will decrease. That's the expected outcome. However, it also depends on whether household and firms are optimistic about future prospects. Why? Because if they feel that, the future is optimistic, then they may not withhold consumption, they may not withhold investment, and then it will break the link. Okay, so this is actually the main limitation of monetary and fiscal in the form of tax policies have, right? And this is actually in your textbook. So I give you an example, right? In the same regard, when we talk about monetary policy, okay, what we expect is if I decrease interest rates, business will spend, household will spend, and C&I will increase, AD increase. But of course, if those of you who were familiar with what happened during the global financial crisis and the global economic recession, okay, monetary policy around the world were ineffective. Why? Because no matter how low the central bank reduces interest rates, because the outlook of the economy is so poor, households didn't want to spend, firms didn't want to invest. Okay, so this is the same as this is the same effect as what happens when same effect as linking your policies to the outcome is very dependent on the outlook of the economy. Okay, and the second disadvantage would be how there's a disincentive to work, saving, and investment, and lastly, also because of the ratchet effect. Again, this is also more theoretical. Okay, and lastly, he talks about the advantage of increasing in taxes. In this case, he talks about how the tax can increase government revenue, and he talks about how this can reduce the negative effects of crowding out. Okay, so I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with the concept of crowding out. Okay, I know that IB students know that crowding out is actually in the syllabus, but they don't quite understand what it means. Okay, so I'm going to do a very quick overview at some time on what crowding out means, right? Crowding out means, crowding out represents a situation when you are competing for a pool of loanable funds, okay? And it only happens under a very specific situation. If a government has to borrow money to spend, okay? If a government has to borrow money to spend, you see, right? If the government wants to spend, the government's objective is to increase AD, okay? But if it has to borrow to spend, it would have to tap into this pool of loanable funds. And because now this pool of loanable funds becomes smaller, now firms will have less funds, fewer funds to also borrow to invest. And this will lead to a crowding out effect because while your government spending can increase, your firm investment will decrease. So you kind of mitigate the effect. Okay, so you want to increase G, to increase AD. However, because you're competing, because you're borrowing to spend, you're competing with the pool of loanable funds, and therefore your firm's investments will decrease. Okay, and why did he particularly bring out the effects of crowding out? Is because he wanted to contextualize it, and that's why there's an underlying sentence that says that private investment is a major component of the Singaporean economy. Okay, so again, this is very specific to the choice of economy that he was writing about, and this is what I meant by contextualizing. Okay, apart from just listing down the advantages and disadvantages, always understand whether can you come up with your own analysis based on what you understand about the economy and the nature of the problem. Okay, and that's actually all I have for today's session. I want to just dive straight into the actual content and show you how it works. And what I think the main takeaway that you guys should have is what I call the 4-4-400 framework, right? What does it mean? Why is it 4-4-400, right? 4 key paragraphs, 4 key pointers in your evaluation, 400 words. Okay, this particular student of mine did the exact same thing for his Micro and Macro International, and basically scored like he scored like very high marks for his IA because he was consistent. And that's why I say this is a tried and tested formula in terms of writing an IA. Follow the guidelines so that you know whether whether are you spending too much time writing about things that are not necessary. And this is why I see in a lot of students. Okay, and so I have actually come to the end of what I intended to present today. So I'll take this opportunity to actually address some of the questions that some of you guys have. Okay, so the first that I have not addressed, what topics will I recommend for each economics IA to ensure a very good grade? So I think I addressed this earlier on at the start, right? If we talk about micro, I would always say go for market failure. Always go for market failure. It is easy to find articles. Okay. Negative externalities are usually easier. Okay, negative externalities are usually easier. So you talk about cigarette, alcohol, gambling, sugar drinks. Those will be the top of my list. Okay, if you want to talk about education, healthcare, which is your merry goods, and like arts, museum visits, possible. I would stay away from price ceiling, price floor, but of course, if you're confident, go for it. And tail the firm, right? So again, you're asking me, you want to ensure good grade, market failure, number one. When we talk about macro, again, I would focus on monetary policy. Because when you talk about monetary policy, it's very straightforward. The impact is on AD, right? The intended impact from AD. The moment you talk about fiscal policy, as I shared with you with this very specific macro IA example that you have here, even though it's fiscal policy, because the government spending is also on education and infrastructure, there is a supply side effect as well. And when there's a supply side effect, you cannot ignore discussing about aggregate supply, intervention in supply side policies. And sometimes students struggle with that because number one, they don't understand supply side policies well enough. Number two, they don't know how to integrate all these concepts because now you're talking about additional concepts into the IA. All right, and the example that I've showed you actually is basically an example of a choice of fiscal policy with supply side effects that I would not encourage. I would say go straight for monetary policy. Okay, and for monetary policy, there are two types. Just to let you know. Okay, there are two types of monetary policy. Number one, monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy that is fighting recession. That is the best. Okay, that is the top of the list. That's the easier monetary policy. The second type of monetary policy would be contractionary monetary policy to fight inflation. Yeah. Okay. Because, and I'm not sure whether you guys have started looking at articles, right? I'm not sure whether you guys know about the situation in the US right now, or not just in the US, right? I think in the EU as well, right? Currently, that is exactly what, or rather over the past 1 or 2 years, that's exactly what the US economy is experiencing, right? Inflation, high inflation. And then at the same time, the Federal Reserve has been increasing interest rate because they want to slow down, they want to prevent the economy from overheating. But when you increase interest rate, there's another competing effect where it would also affect economic growth. And that's why I say that, that's why I would say that I will not choose monetary policy that's trying to fight inflation, because usually there will always be a contrasting impact on economic growth. Okay? Unfortunately, because you guys happen to be doing your IA this year, you can't avoid that. Right? The moment you go monetary policy, you search online, it is all about battling inflation, which means that there's some element of contractionary growth that you also have to talk about. Okay, a couple years back, it was easier for my other students, right? Because there was post-financial crisis, and it was during the time where interest rates were being reduced, with the purpose of trying to increase to ignite economic growth. So that was very straightforward, right? I cut interest rates, I increase C, increase I, increase AD. Straightforward. Okay, when we talk about when we talk about trade, again, tariffs will always be the most common. Okay, tariffs will be most common, and what you want to talk about again, right? Tariff is actually the problem, right? I explained before, right? Because tariff goes against the economic principles of efficiency, and then the solution would be free trade, right? Free trade. It is also quite tricky because what I've seen recently is that quite a number of students, when they choose tariff related articles, quite a number of these articles are quite a number of these tariffs are retaliatory in nature, which makes the data on whether or not it's justifiable to implement a tariff a bit difficult. Okay, so I'll give you a perfect example, right? I think a year back or two, if we talk about tariff, the biggest in the news was China implementing tariffs on Australia wine imports. And that was retaliatory in nature, that was political in nature, and therefore most of the articles lack the necessary economic data to write a good article. Okay, so that's why international, unfortunately, you only have tariffs, so it's still a bit tricky. Okay. Okay, so I want to move on to the next question. Do I know what marks examiner comments these IA received? Okay, all I know is that he basically scored a 7, maxed out his scores for both IAs. He also got a 3 for his EE, and then he also scored a 7 for his HR econ. So I've actually selected the best IA for you. So whatever you've seen here this will secure you as a 7 for sure, the highest marks possible. Okay, so now I have a student actually giving me a link to an article. I think this is a good opportunity for me to give you my comments on what I think about this article. So for the rest of you who are here, you can continue to give me, if you have any articles, I'll be more than happy to give you my comments. So let's look at this choice article. Number one, Reuters. I like Reuters. Reuters is very factual, very objective. You see, again, a quick scan through this article gives me a lot of numbers. Remember what I said about numbers? I like numbers. Okay, so let's see what numbers did they give. Price increases by 5.2%. Okay, so we talk about increase in the floor price, must pay for cane, okay, from this amount to this amount. Okay, okay, I'm going to ignore this. Recovery rate for the floor price, calls for an increase in minimum selling price. India, the world's biggest producer, and so I don't like this article, okay, because if you look at this, right, what is the problem that they are trying to solve? Whoever who gave me this article, what problem have you identified, right? Are you able to draw a diagram to depict this problem? Is this increase in price a solution to combat a problem? Okay, because if we talk about price ceiling and price floor, you need to understand that price ceiling is to help protect low income consumers, right, from paying high prices for essentials like rent and food prices, for example. Price floor is to help domestic producers to ensure that they receive a high enough income and are not susceptible to the fluctuation in prices, especially since they are growing agricultural products. Okay, so if they said increase in the floor price, this is a price floor. Okay, and in terms of the problems, the problem here that I want to see is I want to see them saying that cane producers are suffering from fluctuation in prices. And therefore, the government is implementing an increase in floor price so that they can protect these cane producers. Yeah, then what happens is that not only so I can't see a problem, and I don't see how this increase in price solves the problem. Okay, and that's why I said earlier on I would avoid price setting price floor. Okay, now the next question I have here would be, can I show an example for alternative solutions in macroeconomics? Okay, let me dig into my pool of IAs and see whether can I find something. In the meantime, if you guys have anything else, feel free to also ask away. So I think for the student who asked me about sugar cane floor price, right? Yeah, I think the moment you find yourself struggling to find out what the problem is and how does this solution solve this problem, yeah, then I'll encourage you to just stay away from it. Okay, let me see. Do I have example? Okay, I think I may have. Macro, let's see. Okay, I think I have. Let me see, how can I? Okay, yes, I do have another macro that I can show. Let me just share my screen. Okay, let me see. Okay, so I'm just going to very quickly run through with you. So we're talking about, see again, this student also followed my structure. Introduction, expansionary fiscal policy, and then obviously she defined it. Increase aggregate demand, and then she defined it, right? What aggregate demand is. So this is the second paragraph, right? Remember I said second paragraph is explaining the problem. Okay, in this situation, she was lucky because there were enough information from the article for her to use. Okay, for example, what do I mean by that? Right, escalating US-China trade conflict. Then she used it to talk about how it affects exports. Facility investment sluggish, private spending too slow. Then she talks about how these are related to consumption and investment. AD, remember again the before change after. This is how she applied the before change after, because she talks about how AD increased to AD1 to AD2. And then how GDP changed from Y1 to Y3 instead of Y1 to Y2. Okay, so this is okay. So for the purpose of this, it's a bit more complex because we talk about how there was an increase at first and then afterwards there was a decrease, because that was contextualizing the the question. And then in the second paragraph, rather the third one, is a focus on the policy. In this case, the policy is expansionary fiscal policy. So you see, in order to booster economic growth, government has implemented expansionary fiscal policy. Then she also highlighted what are the increased tax funds, and then she explains how it works, how it affects consumption, a component of AD. Then she quoted private spending projected increase. So this is what I mean by this is a proposed solution, but the article actually talk about the possible impact of the solution. And they say private spending is projected to increase 2.7% this year. And that's how she used it to talk about how this to ascertain that consumption will increase, right? So she's validating her theoretical concepts with numbers given from taken from the question. Okay, another one here, right? Government has pledged to spend 4 trillion won. So that is about that talks about government spending in terms of what areas. Talk about key industrial sectors, infrastructure spending, and training, right? So this also there's some supply side over here, right? So that's why I said, stay away from fiscal, because more often than not, fiscal policy will give you some supply side impact. Yeah, so when she applied the before change after, she was able to even substantiate. Okay, she was able to quote this 5.8% expansion of budget spending, right? So this tells you how much more the government intends to spend over the next 5 years. Okay, now we talk about evaluation. Firstly, this is all your disadvantages, right? Okay, disadvantages. So time lag. What else? Crowding out, or rather, political constraints is another disadvantage. Crowding out is also another disadvantage. Okay, as this policy is being implemented in conjunction with market-oriented intervention in supply side. Yeah, so this is now what she's doing here is contextualize. Why? Because in this particular article, they actually talk about increase in minimum wage. So she cannot ignore it, right? Even though it's a macro concept, even though it's about fiscal policy with supply side impact, she could not ignore this minimum wage thing, especially since the article even talk about how it can hurt entry-level jobs and weigh down the local economy. So this is how she contextualized using information from the article, which means that if you see something that you think you can use to analyze, don't ignore it. Okay, and this is an alternative policy. So obviously, if your main policy is all about fiscal policy, your alternative policy will naturally be your expansionary monetary policy. And then she discuss about what it means, right? Central bank manipulates money supply, decrease interest rates, lower cost of borrowing, consumer and firms, consumer invest, therefore your AD increases. So this is a theoretical explanation of how monetary policy works. One more thing I want to say is that when you introduce an alternative policy, always try to have the same structure in terms of also talking about the advantages and disadvantages of this particular alternative policy. So this is a very good example of how she did it, because firstly, this just explains what the alternative policy is and how the mechanism works. Number two, she talks about the advantages, right? Over here, she said the central bank is independent of the government, so it's easier to implement. Number two, she also talked about it being less likely to face political constraints. So what she did here was that she focused on how the advantages of this alternative policy actually makes it better than the current policy, right? Because in the current policy, there is a risk of crowding out. There's also the risk of political constraint. Okay, and then she moved on to the disadvantages, which is this one. However, with rising uncertainties causing facility investment and private spending to slow down, a decrease in interest rates may not incentivize borrowings. So this, I would say, is a mixture of contextualizing and also understanding the limitation of monetary policy. Why? Because she quoted rising uncertainties. So she knew that the article was talking about uncertainties, and she had to factor these uncertainties into the impact of a possible monetary policy. Okay, and you realize something. I'm not sure how you guys are taught about your conclusion. I've actually never taught my students to write any conclusion, because the conclusion can be assumed through your evaluation paragraph, or it is usually as simple as this sentence that I always ask everyone, all my students to write, right? Is that when you're introducing alternative policies, which is a must, by the way, always talk about the best approach being a combination of all the policies, because there is never a one-size-fits-all solution to any problem. Okay, rarely, right? When we talk about negative externalities, when countries are fighting cigarettes, they always do taxes, they always do advertising, they always do legislation. Like, for example, they restrict the age of people who can buy cigarettes. It's always a combination. When I try to fight recession, it is always monetary policy plus fiscal policy. And so this is kind of like the standard concluding statement that I always ask all my students to write. Given that the challenges the South Korean economy faces are largely due to external factors, again, this is contextualized external factors, it's imperative that government implements a combination of demand management and supply side policies to support its domestic economy. So this is my conclusion, just a simple sentence. Okay, I have another, I think I have another. Okay, so I think someone just sent me an email. Let me just open an email. Maybe it would show an article choice or something, I'm hoping. Okay, I have actually come to the end of the seminar. If you guys have any questions for me, I will be more than happy to address them. Otherwise, feel free to leave. I hope you guys found this useful. Again, if you want to have a copy of this recording, please drop me an email and I'll definitely send it across to you, okay? If not, all the best, everyone. Do stay tuned, because we're going to have more of such seminars coming up. We want to cover almost all the subjects, right? So as I said before, chemistry is going to come next week. Physics is coming 3 weeks from now. And then we're going to do Langlit IO. That's all we have in the pipeline. Okay, if not, thank you everyone. I hope you had a good time. I did, thanks for the, all the questions. I love answering questions, and I hope I managed to answer your questions. Okay, if not, thank you so much and see you. Bye-bye.